There are emergencies that arrive suddenly, a flood that wipes out a city in a night, a war that burns through generations, a famine that empties entire regions. And then there is another kind of emergency, one so long, so slow, that no one recognizes it as a crisis while it is happening. This is the story of that kind of emergency. Not a moment, not a century, but an unbroken condition that shaped humanity for thousands of years. Quietly, relentlessly, without ever declaring itself. By the time humans learned to write, this emergency was already ancient. By the time civilizations rose, it was still ongoing. And by the time modern humans began to study their past, they misunderstood it completely. Because the longest emergency in human history did not look like disaster. It looked like life, long before borders, nations, or even villages. Humans lived in a world that refused to stay stable. Seasons shifted unpredictably. Rains failed without warning. Animals migrated and never returned. Land that once fed entire groups suddenly became useless. No single event caused this instability. There was no day it began. Instead, humanity entered a long stretch of time where certainty disappeared. And once certainty is gone, survival becomes an emergency every day. For early humans, survival was never guaranteed. But in earlier ages, patterns existed. Cold seasons came, then left. Warm periods followed predictable paths. Food scarcity had limits. Then something changed. The environment stopped behaving in ways humans could rely on. Not violently, not dramatically, but persistently. What followed was not a collapse, but a condition, a state where humans were always reacting, never recovering, always adapting, never stabilizing, always surviving, never thriving. This was not a temporary crisis. It became the background of human existence. Children were born into it. Elders died without ever seeing it end. Entire cultures formed inside this emergency and assumed it was normal. This is why it left no monuments. Emergencies that last too long stop being remembered as emergencies. Archaeological layers show this clearly, though the signs are subtle. Tools become simpler, not more complex. Settlements appear briefly, then vanish. Trade routes form and collapse repeatedly. Progress stutters, not because humans lacked intelligence, but because stability never lasted long enough for progress to hold. Every time a group adapted to a new environment, that environment changed again. A grassland dried out, a coastline retreated, a river shifted its path. Food strategies had to be rewritten constantly. Hunting plans failed. Gathering routes broke down. Seasonal knowledge became unreliable. Humans were trapped in a permanent learning curve with no chance to master it. This emergency had a psychological cost. When survival depends entirely on short-term decisions, long-term thinking disappears. Why plan for the future when the land might betray you next year? Why build when abandonment is inevitable? Instead, humans learned something else: flexibility, movement, detachment, the ability to leave everything behind. This is why early humans appear restless in the archaeological record, not because they were aimless, but because staying still was dangerous. Mobility became a survival strategy. Roots were a liability, but mobility has limits. As populations grew, competition increased. As resources shrank, conflict followed. Not organized wars, but constant tension. Borders formed invisibly, defined by hunger and fear rather than lines on a map. The emergency deepened. What makes this emergency unique is that there was no clear enemy, no invading force, no singular disaster, no tyrant to overthrow. The enemy was unpredictability itself, and unpredictability cannot be defeated, only endured. Over generations, humans adjusted their expectations downward. Life became shorter, dreams became smaller. Success meant survival, not advancement. Culture reflected this. Stories focused on endurance, not conquest. Beliefs emphasized appeasing forces beyond control. Rituals centered on preventing loss, not gaining abundance. Religion, myth, and superstition flourished, not because humans were ignorant, but because control had vanished. The emergency reshaped social structures. Groups became tighter, more suspicious of outsiders. Trust was limited. Resources were guarded. Innovation slowed because failure was too costly. When one mistake can kill everyone, experimentation becomes dangerous. This is why, for tens of thousands of years, human progress appears uneven. Long pauses, sudden bursts, then regression again. Historians often describe these periods as primitive. They were not primitive. They were constrained. The emergency also distorted memory. When every generation faces different conditions, knowledge becomes fragile. What worked for parents might fail for children. What elders teach may already be outdated. This breaks continuity. Civilization requires memory. The emergency erased it repeatedly. And yet, humanity did not disappear. Against all odds, humans persisted through this endless instability. They adapted culturally, biologically, psychologically, but at a cost. By the time conditions finally began to stabilize, much later, humanity was shaped by trauma it no longer remembered. This is the tragedy of the longest emergency. It didn't just threaten survival. It rewrote what humans believed was normal. Struggle became expected. Uncertainty became routine. Emergency became life. And the most unsettling question is not how humanity survived it. The question is this: what parts of that emergency never really ended? The longest emergency did not announce itself with alarms or warnings. It rewired human behavior quietly, shaping instincts long before humans understood what instincts were. To survive an unpredictable world, humans had to become unpredictable themselves. This was not a choice. It was adaptation under pressure. In earlier ages, patterns could be trusted. Animals migrated on roughly the same paths. Plants ripened within familiar seasons. Rivers flooded, but usually within known limits. During the long emergency, these patterns broke down. Rain came early, then not at all. Cold arrived without warning. Warm periods ended suddenly. Humans could no longer rely on experience alone. Memory became unreliable. This changed how decisions were made. Instead of planning far ahead, groups focused on the immediate moment. Food today mattered more than food next season. Shelter tonight mattered more than permanent homes. This mindset kept people alive, but it trapped them. When survival becomes short-term, growth becomes impossible. Communities learned to travel light. Anything heavy became a liability. Anything permanent became a risk. This is why early shelters were temporary, why tools were simple, why art, when it existed, was portable. The emergency punished attachment. As conditions worsened, humans became observers of their world rather than masters of it. They watched the sky carefully. They listened to wind patterns. They studied animal behavior with near-obsessive focus. Nature was no longer a background. It was a threat that had to be read constantly. Fear became functional. Not panic, but awareness. The ability to sense danger before it arrived became more valuable than strength or intelligence. Those who ignored warning signs vanished. Those who noticed subtle changes survived. Over generations, this shaped human psychology. The emergency favored anxiety. People who worried more prepared more. People who prepared more survived longer. This created a bias that still exists today. Humans became wired to expect danger, even when none is present. Trust also changed. In stable environments, cooperation expands. In unstable ones, trust contracts. During the long emergency, strangers were risks. Outsiders meant competition for scarce resources. Groups grew smaller. Boundaries hardened. Hospitality became conditional. This did not mean humans became cruel. It meant survival required caution. Sharing food could mean starvation tomorrow. Helping another group could weaken your own. Morality became situational. Ethics bent under pressure. Belief systems emerged from this uncertainty. When humans cannot control their environment, they try to explain it. Stories formed to make sense of chaos. Rituals developed to restore imagined balance. Weather became personal. Nature became intentional. If rain failed, someone must have offended something. These beliefs were not irrational. They served a purpose. They created order in a world without patterns. They gave people a sense of influence when control was impossible. The emergency made belief necessary. Over time, These beliefs hardened into traditions. Certain places became sacred. Certain actions became forbidden. Certain times of year carried fear or hope. Culture was built around managing uncertainty, but uncertainty kept winning. No ritual could guarantee rain. No offering could stop ice. No story could restore predictability. This led to a deep psychological strain. Humans lived with constant low-level stress, not terror but tension, a readiness to move, a readiness to abandon, a readiness to flee. Relaxation became dangerous. This shaped how humans related to time. The future became vague. The past became unreliable. Only the present mattered. This is why long-term projects were rare, why construction remained temporary, why planning beyond a few seasons felt pointless. Even language reflected this shift. Words related to movement, caution, and survival became central. Concepts of permanence were weaker. Home was not a place. It was a condition, temporary safety. Children born during this emergency learned fear early, not fear of monsters or enemies, fear of absence. No food, no warmth, no water. Scarcity shaped childhood. Education became practical rather than abstract. Children learned where to find food, how to read weather signs, when to leave. They were trained for survival, not growth. Art did not disappear, but it changed. Instead of celebrating abundance, it focused on warning and memory. Marks on stone recorded migrations. Symbols marked safe places. Stories warned of dangerous seasons. Creativity served survival. The emergency also slowed technological advancement. Innovation requires risk. Risk was dangerous. If a new tool failed, starvation followed. If a new method wasted resources, people died. So humans relied on proven methods, even if inefficient. Progress became cautious. This explains a mystery in human history, why intelligence existed long before civilization, why creativity existed long before cities. The emergency delayed progress, not because humans were incapable, but because conditions punished failure too harshly. Over thousands of years, this emergency reshaped humanity at a deep level. It selected for patience over ambition, observation over domination, endurance over expansion. These traits allowed survival, but they left scars. When stability finally began to return, much later, humans struggled to recognize it. They were used to crisis, used to movement, used to loss. Peace felt unfamiliar, and this created a paradox. The emergency that nearly broke humanity also prepared it. Humans learned flexibility, adaptability, resilience, traits that would later fuel expansion once conditions allowed. But at the time, none of this was visible. All anyone knew was that the world was unreliable, that tomorrow could betray today, that survival had no guarantees. This was the longest emergency in human history, not because it was dramatic, but because it never truly stopped. The longest emergency did not trap humanity in one place. It did the opposite. It forced humanity into motion. Movement became the default response to danger, scarcity, and uncertainty. When land failed, people left. When animals vanished, people followed. When seasons broke their promises, people searched for better ground. Human history during this time is not the story of settlements. It is the story of departures. Migration is often imagined as a single great journey, a bold decision, a clear destination. But during the long emergency, migration was rarely planned. It happened in fragments. A family moved first. A group followed later. Some stayed behind. Hopping conditions would improve. Most were wrong. The land itself became unreliable. Rivers shifted their paths or dried completely. Lakes shrank into mud flats. Coastlines retreated or flooded. A place that supported life for generations could become useless within a lifetime. This destroyed the idea of permanence. As a result, humans developed a unique relationship with space. They did not own land. They borrowed it. Territory was temporary, conditional, and fragile. If the land failed, loyalty to it ended. This constant movement fragmented human populations. Groups split and reformed repeatedly. Languages drifted apart. Customs changed rapidly. Connections between distant groups weakened. Information traveled slowly and unreliably. Knowledge that could have helped others was often lost before it arrived. The emergency created isolation without walls. Groups lived close enough to be related, but far enough to be strangers. This prevented large-scale cooperation. No shared strategy could survive long enough to spread. Conflict emerged not from ambition, but from overlap. When two groups entered the same shrinking resource zone, tension followed. Not wars, pressure, silent competition. Who arrives first? Who leaves last? Who starves? Violence occurred, but it was usually brief and decisive. Extended conflict wasted energy and resources. The emergency favored quick outcomes. Win fast, lose fast, move on. This environment reshaped leadership. Leaders were not rulers. They were navigators, those who could read land, weather, and animal behavior gained influence. Authority was temporary and conditional. If a leader led people into scarcity, trust vanished. Leadership became pragmatic. Charisma mattered less than accuracy. People followed those who kept them alive. Migration routes became cultural memory. Paths were marked not by signs, but by stories. This valley is dangerous. That river dries early. Those hills mean cold. These oral maps were fragile. If a generation failed to pass them on, the knowledge disappeared. Sometimes, groups followed old routes that no longer worked. Climate had changed. Animals had shifted. Water was gone. Entire migrations ended in silence. This is why the archaeological record is full of absences. Places once occupied, suddenly empty, not destroyed, abandoned. The emergency also prevented cities from forming. Cities require surplus. Surplus requires stability. During the longest emergency, stability was rare. People could not afford to concentrate resources in one place. When disaster struck, cities would trap their inhabitants. Movement remained safer. Even when temporary hubs formed rich valleys, fertile plains, they rarely lasted. A few generations at most. Then conditions changed, and people left. This constant movement slowed specialization. Specialists require predictable food supplies. During the emergency, everyone needed to be adaptable. Hunter, gatherer, scout, defender roles overlapped. Versatility mattered more than mastery. Trade existed, but it was limited. Long-distance trade required trust and consistency. Routes collapsed when conditions shifted. Goods became less valuable than knowledge. How to survive mattered more than what you owned. This also shaped early human networks. Instead of dense societies, humanity became a web of small, loosely connected groups. Information leaked through slowly. Innovation spread unevenly. Some groups advanced briefly, then vanished. Others stagnated, but endured. The emergency rewarded endurance over brilliance. A clever idea that failed could kill everyone. A boring method that worked kept people alive. Risk-taking was punished. Caution dominated. Yet movement had one unexpected effect. It spread humans across vast distances. As groups fled danger, they unknowingly expanded humanity's reach. Deserts were crossed, mountains were passed, coastlines explored, not because humans sought conquest, but because they were running. This created diversity. Different environments shaped different adaptations. Bodies changed, cultures diverged, beliefs evolved independently. Humanity fractured and multiplied, but fragmentation came at a cost. Shared identity weakened. There was no humanity yet. Only groups, only survival. The emergency made history nonlinear. Progress in one region did not spread reliably. Knowledge could vanish entirely if a group died out. Human advancement was constantly reset. This explains why humanity appears to stumble forward. Steps ahead, steps back, not because humans were incapable, but because the world kept shifting beneath their feet. And yet, movement preserved something vital. Hope, the belief that somewhere else might be better, that beyond the horizon, conditions could improve. This belief kept humans walking. But hope has limits. As environments continued to fail, places to flee became fewer. The world began to feel smaller, crowded, hostile. The emergency was tightening. Migration could delay disaster, but not eliminate it. Soon, humanity would face a question it could no longer outrun. What happens when there is nowhere left to go? The longest emergency did not just change where humans lived, it changed how they lived together. For most of human existence, survival depended on cooperation. Small groups relied on shared labor, shared food, and shared knowledge. Trust was not optional, it was survival itself. But an emergency that never ends slowly turns cooperation into a liability. At first, humans worked together because it made sense. Hunting large animals required coordination. Sharing food reduced individual risk. Collective knowledge increased survival chances. In stable environments, cooperation expands. In unstable ones, it contracts. And during the longest emergency, instability became permanent. As resources became unpredictable, cooperation began to fracture under pressure. A successful hunt did not guarantee future food. A good season did not promise the next one. A shared cache could be lost to migration or disaster. Suddenly, sharing became dangerous. Groups began to limit generosity. Food was shared within tighter circles. Trust became conditional. Outsiders were treated cautiously or excluded entirely. This was not cruelty. It was mathematics. If resources cannot be replenished, every act of generosity carries a cost. Over time, group boundaries hardened. Who belonged mattered more than ever. Membership became survival. Those without a group were at extreme risk. This shift reshaped social rules. Kinship became central. Blood ties mattered more than skill. Lineage offered security when the environment could not. Strangers became threats, not because they were violent, but because they competed for the same shrinking resources. Conflict emerged not from ambition, but from desperation. Two groups occupying the same territory could not both survive indefinitely. Eventually, one had to move or disappear. Most conflicts were not large or dramatic. They were brief, local, and often left no physical trace. A skirmish over a water source, an ambush along a migration path, a quiet decision to deny access. These conflicts erased people without monuments or records. The emergency favored avoidance over domination. Winning a fight consumed energy. Energy was precious, so humans learned to signal danger instead of engaging. Warning signs, territorial markers, stories meant to discourage approach. Fear became a tool. This also changed leadership structures. Earlier leaders were valued for wisdom and experience. Now, leaders were valued for decisiveness. Hesitation could be fatal. Groups followed those who acted quickly, even harshly, because speed mattered more than fairness. Authority became situational. A leader who succeeded in one season could fail in the next. Leadership shifted frequently. There were no kings, only guides temporarily trusted. The emergency also reshaped cooperation at a larger scale. Trade between groups became rare and risky. Routes changed constantly. Trust was fragile. Agreements were short-lived. Information exchange slowed. Knowledge became isolated. This isolation had long-term consequences. Innovations did not spread widely. Techniques remained local. Mistakes were repeated independently. Humanity learned the same lessons again and again because communication failed. Even language began to drift faster. Groups separated frequently. Contact was intermittent. Words changed meaning. Dialects diverged. Shared understanding fractured. Rituals and beliefs filled the gaps. When cooperation fails, symbolism replaces it. Shared rituals created internal unity. When external trust collapsed, belief systems became more rigid, not flexible. Rules were enforced strictly because breaking them threatened group survival. Punishment became severe. Mistakes were no longer tolerated. A single error could doom everyone. So groups enforced conformity. Innovation slowed further. This created a paradox. Human survival depended on adaptability, but social survival depended on predictability. The emergency forced humans to choose stability over experimentation. As a result, progress stagnated, not because humans lacked ideas, but because they could not afford failure. The emergency also changed how humans remembered the past. History became myth. Specific events were replaced with symbolic stories. Lessons were preserved through metaphor rather than detail. Accuracy mattered less than emotional impact. This made memory resilient, but imprecise. Knowledge survived, but distorted. Generations grew up believing the world was inherently hostile. That scarcity was normal. That safety was temporary. That trust was risky. These beliefs became embedded. Even when conditions briefly improved, humans did not fully relax. They expected betrayal from nature, from other groups, from the future. The emergency had trained them well, but something else was happening beneath the surface. Despite fragmentation, despite mistrust, humans were learning. Slowly, painfully, they were developing new ways to cooperate, smaller, tighter, more resilient. Families replaced large clans. Bands replaced tribes. Networks became flexible instead of rigid. Human society became modular, breakable but rebuildable. This flexibility prevented total collapse. When one group failed, others survived. Humanity did not rise together, but it did not fall together either. The emergency did not eliminate cooperation. It reshaped it from large-scale unity to small-scale resilience, from permanence to adaptability. But this adaptation came with a hidden cost. When the world finally began to stabilize, when the emergency slowly loosened its grip, humans were no longer prepared to trust easily. They had survived too long without certainty. The longest emergency had trained humanity to expect loss, to plan for failure, to survive alone if necessary. And when stability returned, this mindset would shape everything that followed, including civilization itself. The end of the longest emergency did not arrive the way disasters usually end. There was no victory, no announcement, no moment when humanity collectively realized the danger had passed. Because when an emergency lasts long enough, its ending looks like an illusion. For generations, the world had taught humans one lesson over and over again. Do not trust stability. So when conditions slowly began to change, no one celebrated. They watched, they waited, they assumed betrayal. The first signs of change were subtle. Seasons lingered a little longer than expected. Rains returned to places long abandoned. Animals followed more predictable paths. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a slight easing of pressure. Groups that had learned to move quickly hesitated. Should they stay? Or was this another false promise? History had trained them to leave at the first sign of danger. But it had also trained them not to hope. Some groups tested the land cautiously. They stayed an extra season. They returned to the same valley twice. They planted where they once only gathered. Most attempts failed at first. Soil was thin. Knowledge was lost. Techniques were imperfect. Failure reinforced old beliefs. The emergency had not just shaped behavior, it had shaped expectations. People believed hardship was permanent, and belief can outlast reality. But change continued, not evenly, not everywhere. Some regions stabilized sooner than others. Others remained harsh. Humanity experienced a fragmented ending to the emergency, one group at a time. Those who lived in improving regions gained advantages. They stayed longer. They stored more. They experimented carefully. The emergency punished recklessness, but it no longer punished patience as severely. Slowly, a new behavior emerged. Planning, not long-term yet, but longer than before. A season ahead, a year ahead. This was revolutionary. With planning came investment. People built better shelters. They repaired instead of abandoning. They began marking territory, not to warn others away, but to return. Place regained meaning. But this shift created tension. Groups who adapted quickly gained stability. Groups who clung to old survival strategies kept moving. Two different versions of humanity began to exist at the same time. Those who stayed looked strange to those who left. Why risk attachment? Why build when escape had always been safer? Those who stayed were accused of arrogance or foolishness. But staying worked. Sometimes, and sometimes was enough. The emergency had conditioned humans to interpret survival as movement. Now survival began to look like stillness. This required unlearning. As stability increased, social structures shifted again. Trust expanded cautiously. Sharing increased, but selectively. Memory returned. Knowledge could be preserved. because people remained long enough to pass it on. Children grew up knowing the same land as their parents. This had not happened for tens of thousands of years. It changed everything. Stories shifted. Instead of warnings, they became instructions. Instead of escape routes, they described seasons. Instead of laws, they spoke of cycles. Culture stabilized alongside climate, but the emergency had not fully ended. It lingered in habits. People still stored excessively, still distrusted abundance, still prepared to flee. These behaviors were no longer necessary, but they felt essential. The human mind adapts faster to danger than to safety. Fear fades slowly. Some groups refused to settle at all. They continued moving, believing stillness would invite disaster. They survived, but they fell behind. Others accumulated knowledge, technology, and social complexity. The gap widened. This divergence created inequality, not of wealth, but of opportunity. Stability allowed experimentation. Experimentation allowed progress. Progress allowed power. The emergency had delayed civilization. Its ending enabled it, but not everyone crossed that threshold together. The earliest forms of agriculture emerged not from ambition, but from exhaustion. People were tired of running. They were tired of uncertainty. They were willing to risk failure for the chance of predictability. Farming was fragile at first. Crops failed. Yields fluctuated. Knowledge was incomplete. But unlike earlier attempts, people did not abandon the effort immediately. They tried again and again. Persistence replaced flight. This persistence would have been impossible during the height of the emergency. The world finally allowed mistakes. That permission changed history, but the emergency left scars. Early societies overreacted to threat. They built defenses where none were needed. They hoarded resources. They distrusted neighbors. These behaviors shaped early civilizations. Cities emerged, but they were anxious cities, surrounded by walls, ruled by strict systems, obsessed with control. The emergency had taught humanity that loss comes suddenly. Civilization internalized that fear. Even as abundance grew, fear remained. This is why early civilizations often collapsed quickly. They carried emergency psychology into a non-emergency world. They overexploited. They overcontrolled. They fractured under pressure. The end of the emergency did not make humans peaceful. It made them cautious builders. Most importantly, the emergency changed humanity's relationship with time. For the first time, people believed the future could be shaped, not guaranteed, but influenced. This belief was fragile. It required constant reinforcement, but it existed, and once it existed, history accelerated. The emergency that lasted thousands of years finally loosened its grip, not because the world became kind, but because humans learned to recognize stability when it appeared. Yet the question remains, if humanity learned survival in crisis. What happens when crisis returns? Even after the world softened, the emergency did not disappear. It simply changed form. Humanity believed the danger was behind them, but belief and reality were no longer aligned. The skies were calmer, the seasons more predictable, food more reliable, and yet something fundamental remained broken, because emergencies do not only shape landscapes, they reshape minds. Long after the longest emergency loosened its grip on the planet, it remained alive inside human behavior. People reacted to small threats as if they were catastrophic. They stockpiled beyond reason. They prepared for disasters that never came. These were not cultural quirks. They were inherited survival responses. The emergency had lasted so long that it rewired the species. Thousands of generations had lived under constant instability. Those who questioned danger died. Those who trusted calm perished. Only the cautious survived. Natural selection favored fear. As stability returned, fear did not retreat. It embedded itself into decision-making. Early societies struggled not because resources were scarce, but because trust was. Communities feared outsiders, even when cooperation would have benefited them. Leaders ruled harshly not out of cruelty, but out of expectation. Something terrible was always coming. This mindset shaped power structures. Authority became centralized. Rules became rigid. Punishment became severe. Order was valued above compassion, because during the emergency, hesitation killed. Even when the emergency ended, humanity did not unlearn this lesson. Instead, it institutionalized it. Civilizations rose on the foundation of fear management. Granaries were guarded. Borders were defended. Surpluses were controlled, not because people were evil, but because scarcity had once been absolute. The irony was brutal. The emergency ended, but its psychological legacy caused new crises. Over-control led to rebellion. Over-extraction led to collapse. Over-planning led to rigidity. Civilizations fell not from chaos, but from fear of chaos. History became cyclical. Collapse followed growth. Growth followed collapse. Humanity had escaped environmental emergency only to create social ones. And every time a civilization collapsed, it reinforced the ancient belief: the world is not safe. These collapses were smaller than the ancient emergency, but they felt just as real. People remembered suffering more vividly than stability. Trauma does that. As centuries passed, humanity forgot the original emergency, but not its lessons. They forgot why they feared. They only remembered that they feared. This created myths, stories of floods that destroyed everything, of fires that fell from the sky, of ages of darkness. These were not exaggerations. They were echoes. The emergency had fragmented human memory. Its duration exceeded the lifespan of storytelling. No single myth could contain it, so it survived as atmosphere. Even today, modern humans carry its weight. Our obsession with preparedness, our fear of collapse, our fascination with apocalypse, these are not products of modern anxiety. They are ancient reflexes. The emergency taught humanity that survival is temporary, and that lesson never faded. This explains something strange about human history. Why do advanced societies expect collapse? Why do cultures imagine endings more vividly than futures? Why do humans build civilizations while assuming they will fail? Because for most of human existence, failure was inevitable. Survival was conditional, temporary. Hope was dangerous. When the emergency finally ended, humanity did not suddenly trust permanence. They had no evidence it existed. Even technological progress did not erase this belief. Instead, technology became another form of control, another attempt to outpace disaster. But the emergency had one final trick. It trained humanity to misread slow threats. During the emergency, danger was immediate. Cold, hunger, sudden loss. Humans became experts at reacting quickly, but they became blind to gradual collapse. This blindness would later cost civilizations dearly. Soil erosion, climate shifts, resource depletion. These moved too slowly to trigger emergency instincts. Humanity survived the longest emergency by reacting fast. Later, they struggled because they failed to react slowly. The emergency created a paradox. It saved humanity, and it cursed humanity. By the time written history began, humans were already shaped by tens of thousands of years of crisis. Writing did not record the emergency. It recorded its aftermath. This is why history feels unstable. Empires rise suddenly, fall unexpectedly, repeat mistakes relentlessly. The emergency had taught humanity resilience, but not wisdom. And yet, something else survived: adaptability. Humans did not just endure the emergency. They learned from it subconsciously. They learned flexibility, improvisation, cooperation under pressure. These traits allowed civilization to exist at all. Without the emergency, humanity might have stagnated. Without constant pressure, innovation might never have occurred. So the emergency was not only destruction, it was also preparation. It forged a species capable of surviving extremes, of restarting, of rebuilding, but it never taught humanity how to rest. Even now, modern humans feel uneasy during calm periods. Peace feels temporary. Stability feels suspicious. We wait for disruption because once, long ago, disruption was constant. The longest emergency did not end in a moment. It faded into habit. It dissolved into culture. It hid inside systems. And that is why it remains the longest emergency in human history. not because it lasted the longest, but because it never truly left. The most dangerous thing about the longest emergency was not what it destroyed, it was what it normalized. After thousands of years of instability, humanity stopped seeing crisis as an exception. It became the default state of existence. Every generation assumed survival required constant readiness, constant tension, constant sacrifice. Emergency was no longer a phase. It was the blueprint. This blueprint shaped how humans built societies, even when they no longer needed to. Settlements were placed defensively rather than efficiently. Food systems prioritized storage over sustainability. Leadership rewarded decisiveness over empathy. These choices made sense during chaos, but in stability, they produced fragility. Civilizations that emerged after the emergency were not designed for peace. They were designed for survival under threat. This explains why early civilizations often collapsed suddenly. They were overbuilt for danger and underbuilt for balance. Rigid systems crack when pressure changes. The emergency had taught humanity to respond to danger, but not to prevent it. As agriculture spread and populations grew, humans believed they had conquered uncertainty. Fields replaced forests, calendars replaced instincts, walls replaced mobility. But beneath these innovations lived an ancient assumption. Something will go wrong. That assumption drove expansion. If disaster was inevitable, growth became a race against time. Build more, store more, control more. Civilizations expanded not because they were confident, but because they were afraid of stagnation. Stagnation felt like death. Ironically, this fear-driven expansion created new emergencies. Deforestation changed rainfall. Overfarming exhausted soil. Trade networks spread disease. The emergency had ended, but humanity recreated it, piece by piece. This cycle repeated across continents. Different cultures, different technologies, same outcome. Collapse followed overreach, and every collapse reinforced the ancient lesson. Survival is temporary. Even when societies recovered, they remembered failure more than success. The emergency had trained humanity to prioritize memory of pain. This is why historical records are obsessed with disasters. Floods, famines, wars. These events were not just dramatic, they resonated with ancestral experience. Humans remembered crisis because crisis once defined existence. Over time, the emergency became mythologized, not as one event, but as many. A flood here, a dark age there, a fire from the sky. These myths were not lies. They were fragments of a much larger truth. The emergency fractured human memory. It was too long, too vast, too repetitive to be remembered as a single story. So it became many stories. Each culture remembered a piece. Each civilization inherited a warning. But warnings fade when prosperity grows. As technologies advanced, humans began to believe they were different, smarter, stronger, protected. They believed the emergency was behind them, that it belonged to primitive times. But the emergency was not a technological problem. It was a systems problem. Technology did not erase vulnerability. It rearranged it. Industrialization created abundance, but also dependence. Cities grew massive, but fragile. Supply chains stretched thin. Humanity became more efficient and less resilient. This was the opposite of what the emergency had trained humans for. Ancient survival favored flexibility. Modern systems favored optimization. Optimized systems fail catastrophically when disrupted. Flexible systems fail slowly. The emergency had forged flexibility. Modernity dismantled it. This created a dangerous illusion that humanity had escaped emergency. That collapse was no longer possible, but history whispered otherwise. Small shocks revealed cracks, economic crashes, pandemics, climate anomalies. Each one reminded humanity that stability was conditional. The emergency was not gone. It was dormant, and dormancy is more dangerous than awareness. The emergency had always arrived gradually. Cold crept in. Food declined slowly. Habit masked danger. Humanity had survived before because adaptation was constant. Now adaptation lagged behind complexity. This raised a frightening question. Was the longest emergency truly over? Or had it simply changed form again? Because emergencies do not announce themselves. They unfold quietly. The ancient emergency taught humans to watch the sky and the land. Modern emergencies hide in numbers, systems, and trends. And humanity struggles to feel threatened by things it cannot see. The emergency once forced humanity to cooperate. Now division weakens that instinct. The longer stability lasts, the harder it becomes to imagine losing it. This is the paradox of survival. The emergency prepared humanity for hardship, but not for abundance. Abundance creates complacency. Complacency invites fragility. Fragility accelerates collapse. The emergency's final lesson was never learned. Survival requires humility. Humans survived because they adapted to forces greater than themselves. But modern humans increasingly believe they control those forces. This belief is dangerous. The longest emergency did not exist to destroy humanity. It existed to shape it. And now, shaped by ancient crisis, but living in artificial calm, humanity stands at a crossroads. Will it remember why it survived? Or will it forget until the next emergency reminds it? Because history does not repeat exactly, but it echoes, and echoes grow louder when ignored. The longest emergency in human history did not end with fire, flood, or ice. It ended quietly, so quietly that no one noticed it was ending at all. There was no final catastrophe. No clear victory. No moment where humanity could say, "We survived." The danger simply thinned. The pressure eased, and life continued. This is why the emergency was never remembered as an event. It was remembered as existence. By the time humans began recording history, the emergency was already buried beneath layers of adaptation. People no longer described survival as extraordinary. It was assumed the world was harsh. That was normal. And so the greatest crisis humanity ever faced passed into prehistory without a name. But its consequences did not. The emergency left behind a species permanently changed. Humans became planners, anticipators, worst-case thinkers. We imagine futures not as possibilities, but as threats. We ask, what if everything goes wrong? Before we ask anything else. This mindset once saved us. Now it defines us. Even today, humanity behaves as if collapse is always near. Why do we store more than we need? Why do we fear shortages, even during abundance? Why do we obsess over endings? Because once, endings came without warning. The emergency trained humanity to expect loss. Modern humans may not remember the ancient cold, the endless hunger, the instability that lasted longer than civilizations. But our instincts do. We prepare for disasters we have never experienced. We feel unease during long periods of calm. We distrust permanence. These are not flaws. They are survival echoes. Yet echoes can mislead. The emergency rewarded caution, but it also punished stagnation. Those who refused to adapt died. Those who adapted too slowly vanished. Adaptation was the true victory. Now humanity faces a strange inversion. We are surrounded by systems designed to prevent emergencies. Yet those same systems make us vulnerable to new ones. We live in a world optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Ancient humans survived by flexibility. Modern humans survive by dependency. This is not inherently wrong, but it is dangerous if misunderstood. The longest emergency taught humanity that nothing is guaranteed, but modern civilization behaves as if guarantees exist. That contradiction is the fault line of our future. Every major collapse in recorded history followed the same pattern. Confidence replaced caution. Control replaced humility. Complexity replaced adaptability. The emergency taught humans to respect forces beyond control. But success made us forget that lesson. This does not mean humanity is doomed. It means humanity is unfinished. The emergency was not a punishment. It was a test, and survival was only the first phase. The second phase is understanding. Understanding that stability is not permanent. Understanding that progress is fragile. Understanding that survival depends not on dominance, but balance. The ancient emergency forced humanity to cooperate or die. Today, cooperation is optional. That is the danger, because emergencies do not ask permission. They arrive when systems are weakest, not when people are ready. The longest emergency did not end because humanity conquered nature. It ended because conditions changed. Humanity adapted. That's all. We did not win. We endured. And endurance is not immunity. If there is one final lesson hidden in the emergency, it is this: the world does not owe us stability. Everything we build exists within forces larger than ourselves. Climate, ecology, geology, time. Ignoring these forces does not stop them. It only delays consequences. The ancient emergency unfolded slowly enough for adaptation. Future emergencies may not. This is why remembering the longest emergency matters, not as fear, but as humility. Humanity's greatest strength has never been technology. It has been adaptation, and adaptation begins with awareness. The emergency shaped who we are. It gave us foresight, imagination, memory. These are not accidents. They are tools forged under pressure. The question is whether we will use them, because emergencies do not always look like emergencies. Sometimes they look like normal life until it's too late. The longest emergency did not announce itself. It crept in, stayed, then faded, and one day, humanity realized the world felt lighter. We live in that light now, but light does not mean safety. It means opportunity. The emergency is not a warning of doom. It is proof of survival. Humanity endured the unimaginable. We adapted through instability longer than any civilization has ever existed. That story is not one of fear. It is one of resilience. But resilience is not automatic. It must be chosen again and again. The longest emergency shaped us. The next one will test us. And history will not ask whether we were advanced, only whether we were